All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Intimate Partner Violence and LGBTQ Relationships, Systemic, Cultural, and Faith Issues. I'll introduce our presenters in just a few moments, but first we have to go over some technical information. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. And if you're having other technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to connect again. All audience members are muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to me via the question feature on the right side of your screen. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to send your questions anytime. I'll hold on to them until the last 15 minutes. If for some reason you don't see the question box on your screen, there should be a small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, so you can expand that. That will give you more features, and you should be able to see the question box. The slides you see on the screen today will be sent to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have them as a resource. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website. So we hope that those listening in the future will enjoy the presentation. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for their sponsorship of today's webinar. They are a national charity with a mission to serve donors, spread joy, and change lives. This series of webinars is part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. They've sponsored dozens of webinars in the past as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. We have many recordings of those webinars on our website, so I suggest that you come back, take a look, and there's some great presentations available. You can visit infaithfound.org to learn more about the great work that they're doing, and we thank them for their partnership. So we have 4 great presenters today, and unfortunately we're not going to have time to do all of their great work justice in the introductions, but I'm going to make this brief. First, we have Connie Burk, who is the Executive Director of the Northwest Network of Bisexual, Trans, Lesbian, and Gay Survivors of Abuse, which has been at the forefront of bringing analysis, assessment tools, and innovative strategies to assist survivors of abuse. We have Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis, who currently serves as Affiliate Professor at McCormick Theological Seminary. She is a former Chicago police officer of 31 years and has recently published the book African American Battered Women, A Study in Gender Entrapment. We're delighted to have Reverend Dr. Marvin Ellison with us today. He served on the faculty of Bangor Theological Seminary from 1981 until its close in 2013. He's the author of many articles and books on the ethics of human sexuality and justice, including Making Love Just, Sexual Ethics for Perplexing Times. He's the Director of Alumni Relations at Union Theological Seminary. And lastly, we have Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She's the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. So, Marie, I'm going to hand it over to you now. Are you with me?
Thank you. Am I with you?
I've got you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have this time together as 4 colleagues working on these issues together, and we want to find out who you are. So we have a short poll, and if you would just take a moment and note which category fits best for you. It'll just give us a quick overview of who all is on the webinar today, and then we can speak directly to your concerns. This is the second of 3 webinars that we're doing on LGBTQ issues around intimate partner violence. The first one we did, which was I think in the spring, one of the things we realized in doing it was that in the conversation, we had started out just having a general conversation about the issues, and realized that what we needed was a much more in-depth conversation about the institutional and social dynamics that both shape the experiences of survivors and abusers, but also shape our capacity to respond to them in faith communities. And so we decided to have 2 more rounds of the webinar, this one today, and then part 3 will be in November, and you'll see that at the end. And there we will focus on specific pastoral issues in responding to intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community in faith communities. So if you have those pastoral issues, try to hold them until the November session. And today we're going to do more social analysis of, what's the context that we're all dealing with here. Could we go back to the poll for a minute? I missed the results. Okay, so you are advocates. And the fact that there are virtually no clergy on this call is not acceptable, and the 4 of us will speak to that, I'm sure, before we are done. But thank you very much as advocates for being here and helping us work through what can be a complex issue and experience in our community. So basically we're going to look at the systemic issues of homophobia, heterosexism, and transphobia, and talk some about the misconceptions and the specific issues for LGBTQ survivors, and then talk critically about how our faith communities have failed and hopefully how we can do a better job of engaging and being available to support folks who are dealing with these issues. So that's what we're going to work on today. And again, we welcome your comments and questions along the way. Feel free to go ahead and send them to Sarah, and then we'll get to them at the end. Okay, Sarah, next. So I've asked both Connie and, I've asked Sharon to comment on the definitions. These are the basic definitions of intimate partner violence. But in the context of our work in the LGBTQ community, to comment on the definitions and how is the violence different or not different in the LGBTQ community. Sharon?
Hi, and hello, everyone. I think the first thing that we really need to recognize in intimate partner violence, domestic violence, however you would term it, is that in both the lesbian, gay, transgender questioning community and in communities where you have heterosexual relationships, that in this basic understanding of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, that there are strong similarities. And so we wanted to make sure that you had that in your psyche first, that the basis of all domestic violence, intimate partner violence, is power and control. That regardless of who the perpetrator is, or regardless of who the victim survivor is, the dynamics of what this is about is the same. It is about power and control. Domestic violence is a learned relationship. The goal of it is to achieve power and control over the partner, regardless of the genders of the one that are in the relationship. The domestic violence is intentional, and it's coercive, and its main goal is to intimidate and to get power over. So then it doesn't matter whether you're in an intimate relationship, whether it's a partner violence, whether it's dating violence, it's all the same in terms of what the pattern of behavior is. And again, we stress that it's a pattern of behavior where one person is dominating another, isolating another, intimidating another to maintain this particular power and control. And as we talk about domestic violence in general, we always want to let people know that it's not by genetics caused, it's not by illness, it's not by alcohol and drugs, it's not because someone was quote unquote angry or had stress. It is, or the behavior of the victim. Many times they're saying, well, it's their fault because they made me do it, they made me angry. It is not that. And so when we're talking about intimate partner violence, I think the important thing to understand as we go into the specificities of intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community is to understand that at its basic level, it is the same.
Okay. Very good, Sharon. Thank you. So that's our starting point. So now if we move on and add to the mix then the issues of heterosexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and I've asked Connie and Marvin to speak if they would like to any of these in terms of just, again, creating the content, the particular context that we're dealing with today for the generic experience that Sharon was outlining for us. Marvin, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks, Marie. So in addition to the abuse dynamic, another complication is the broader social cultural context that has been shaped by these three dynamics of heterosexism, homophobia, and transphobia. One of the ways I think about heterosexism is that it presumes there's one and only one right way to be human. And you're normal or you're not normal and deviant. So heterosexism sets up this norm-deviant paradigm to divide the community between the right and the wrong. So for those of us who are LGBTQ, that means we're not only perceived as different, but also as wrong, different and defective. And this sets up then this pathology response that perceives LGBTQ people as intrinsically sick or sinful or criminal. So I think the language is common, but one word I might add about both homophobia and transphobia is certainly that can show up as feelings of loathing, even fear, hatred of the LGBTQ other, but it can also show up in quotes more subtly as disrespect, a devaluing of LGBTQ persons as somehow not fully human. It can also show up as rendering our lives and our relationships as invisible, not noticed, not taken into account.
And Marvin, I wanted to just add on to your comments about that since I'm now living in Tennessee, I was at the grocery store and saw a bumper sticker that said, queer is not normal, ... That's why it's queer. And I thought, okay, I know where I live now. But I think that's basically what you're getting at in terms of the definition of normal in terms of heterosexuality, and anything that deviates from that is not normal. So, Connie, you want to comment? You got to unmute yourself. Hello, Connie.
Connie? Well,
Okay. We're going to move on and wait for Connie to find her unmute button. Sarah will work on that. Okay, let's go ahead, Sarah, with the next. So this is a version of the power and control wheel, which is probably familiar to most of you, particularly as advocates The original was developed a number of years ago by the Duluth Project to help us see.
Hello?
Connie, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I recalled in because for some reason you could not hear me before, but
Okay, you're back.
I'm
So
back. Yes.
do you have any comment back on heterosexism, homophobia, and transphobia?
I do, and I was going to talk about those sections under the wheel too, so I could do it at either time. Want me to jump in right now with it, or?
Sure, well, go ahead,
Okay.
and then we'll go to the wheel.
So there are 2 points that I would make. One is that it's important for us to understand that homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism, while they particularly target LGBTQ people in specific ways, they actually create a context that harms everybody and all survivors of abuse. So many of us who've worked in domestic violence programs and in shelters in particular have heard stories from heterosexual women who have been told by their abusive husbands or boyfriends, if you go down to that shelter, there's lesbians there, you'll be taking my kids to an unsafe space, you'll be harming my kids, you'll be putting them in harm's way. And in that way, homophobia is being leveraged, and there's no gay people in that room, right? But homophobia is leveraged to maintain a system of power and control. And so I think it's important for us to understand that these harms, racism, classism, heterosexism, that they are not just something that's added on to a certain group's experience. They actually structure up the way we understand relationships, the way we understand gender expectations, and that's happening with everybody. Also, as we'll learn later, bisexual women experience the highest rate of intimate partner violence, and so it's important to recognize how biphobia or homophobia, how homophobia working with people who are in relationships with perhaps a woman in relationship with a heterosexual man, for example, can really be experiencing a lot of harm behind homophobia, biphobia, heterosexism, and we can't just assume we know what that person's experience is because it looks like a straight relationship to us. And then the last point I would make in terms of to the point about how this is running in our communities and faith communities in particular, that those pieces of loathing or demeaning folks or doing that in subtle ways, all of that is so important for us to notice and root out. But I think in faith communities we also have to look at that dynamic of only approaching LGBTQ community as a group to be helped, as sinners to be saved, and in that way we're open to them and willing to show up for them, but as equal partners at the table, as people willing to say what their needs are and to get access to resources, then suddenly it's like a different story. So that's sometimes a more subtle way that heterosexism plays out, denying communities access to resources to make solutions for their own lives.
Very good, and I think we should talk more about that in terms of how our faith communities can fall into that unintentionally, but not in a helpful way. So let's go to the power and control wheel and use that as our jumping off place. As I was beginning to say, this is the Duluth model power and control wheel, but it's specifically designed to address the issues in the LGBTQ communities. And so I've asked each of you to comment on one of these areas, but for those of you who are familiar with the wheel, I'm sure you've used the wheel in other settings. And again, you will get this in your, after the webinar so that you can look more specifically at each of the areas because the type is very small. So let's go to the first one, Sarah, for Sharon to comment on.
Well, it actually looks like we have lost Sharon briefly. Hopefully she's calling back in.
Okay, let's go to...
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yay!
Yes.
I am here, but I'm on the telephone now, and my PowerPoints are not changing on my computer.
Okay. So let's go. Can you go ahead and do your comment on the entitlement portion of the wheel, Sharon?
Sure.
Okay.
And I think that particular piece says that treating people as inferior for race, education, wealth,
Yep.
policy.
Yep.
as privilege. Okay, that's the one.
That's the one.
And so one of the hurdles in the midst of that is what was said earlier, helping people to not see people that are LGBTQ as different or as someone needing to be saved, and not taking it serious what they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
And so demanding that they, I'll give you a story about that.
Yeah.
In terms of clear-cut gender roles. That one of the ladies that I was counseling and being with had a problem because in her particular role as a female, it was not clear-cut. She was masculine in the midst of how she dressed and how she looked, and her partner was demanding in the midst of that. They were demanding in the midst of that she wear earrings, that she that she wear makeup, that she talked a certain way and walked a certain way, and this person lost their entire sense of self because she thought she was acting in a way in which the inside of her told her to act, but her partner demanded that she change so that she could be comfortable for her, because she was looking for a more feminine partner. And this particular person has been like she's been for a while. She was masculine, and she didn't want to be feminine. She didn't want to wear earrings. She didn't want to wear makeup, but she was being almost demanded to do so, and that damaged her in terms of her sense of self and her relationship with that person.
Okay, thank you. Good example of the expectation of a controlling partner to define how the other partner behaves, dresses, acts, and so forth. If you go to the next one. So, Marvin, what about intimidation?
Well, let me just say that I think one of the struggles around these issues, including for LGBTQ folks who are being abused, is to recognize abuse as, I think people too often reduce abuse to physical violence. And so when they think of abuse, they think of someone being physically hit and harmed. But intimate violence, of course, takes many forms that are not physical, including ongoing intimidation. I remember hearing a young gay man talking about his experience in an abusive relationship where his partner often gave him what he called the look, which was looking at him in a particular way to communicate that he was stepping out of line and needed to correct his behavior and comply with the wishes of the abusive partner. I'm really very grateful for a distinction I think Ann Ganley made about the difference between hands-on and hands-off battering. And the insight that in looking at the power and control wheel, there are many dynamics that work to establish and maintain control other than physical violence. And what's important is to focus not just on what is taking place, but on what the abusive partner is doing in order to gain and maintain that power and control.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Okay, Connie, back to you.
Yeah, and to that last point, I would say that in same-sex domestic violence in particular, that really having to look at the context, intent, and effect of behaviors to even understand how it might be working with power and control, because of just the, because how often we use gender as a default for understanding the meaning of a certain behavior. And So, for homophobia and transphobia, we talked a little bit a couple minutes ago about how homophobia and transphobia structure the world we live in and create the vulnerability for so many people to be abused. But we also can see how homophobia and transphobia can be leveraged by an individual in an individual relationship. So I want people to understand that even though it's a slice on the wheel, it also structures the environment that the wheel exists in. But this is how we're going to look right now at how an individual batterer could leverage homophobia and transphobia to control their partner or further their power over them. And in that, the example Sharon just gave of controlling expressions of sexual identity or gender identity, that's one way that homophobia or transphobia is leveraged. And in the case that she gave, that the entitlement that person felt because I feel uncomfortable about this, that you can't do it, right? But what they were leveraging was also this transphobia, this idea that that there's a binary way, that there's a clear-cut way that women are supposed to look, and that you can demand that happen, and that the community should support you around that. But two other things I want to pull out. One is this question of outing. So I think a lot of us have a sense of how outing can be leveraged by a batterer to threaten to out somebody. There are many places where people could lose their jobs to this moment. They could, if their teachers are very concerned about this, nurses, so there's the threat of outing that batterers often use to control their partner, to keep them isolated. But I want us to really think about also how people can use controlling their partner's ability to come out. So you can tell your partner, you can't tell anyone we're together, because if you do, that could out me, and therefore it would be dangerous for me. And so now it has to be secret that we're in a relationship, and now you can't tell anyone any of the harm that I'm doing. So both outing, the threaten to out, and the controlling of how people share their own identities with their friends or family or their community, both can be leveraged by batterers by leveraging the consequences of homophobia and transphobia in the world around them. And then I also just want to point out, for bisexual people and bisexual women in particular, having conversations with bisexual folks about their experience of abuse, one thing that bisexual women have talked about is that for the bisexual women in the data we're going to look at, they were overwhelmingly battered by men. And and one thing they said that was different than a lot of heterosexual women describe in their relationships is many of the bisexual women that we've talked to said that the abuse did not start until after they came out as bisexual. So they were in a relatively stable relationship. It wasn't the story where 3 months in they found themselves abused, right? About the time you got the isolation in place. That this sometimes was years into their relationship, at the point that they came out to their partner's behavior changing, their male partner's behavior changing significantly towards them. A sense of lack of control over the idea that they couldn't control that aspect of their female partner's sexuality, that their girlfriend or wife or whomever had this part of their life that was, about them and about that woman and not about the male partner. And this was even for women who it wasn't that they were out having dates or something, right? They just were sharing this part of their identity. So I think that really tells us about the consequences of biphobia, of heterosexism, of the idea that if you don't have your even internal desires expressed in this very particular way, that it gives somebody permission to punish you, to humiliate you, to make demands of you, to all these things. So I think it's important for us to learn learn from folks who are telling us some different things than maybe we've heard before, and that's definitely a different, that's different from many people's experience of when the onset of abuse happened.
Right. That's really interesting. I appreciate your sharing that, and I'm thinking the whole time about within faith communities, the complexity of both being in or out or whatever in terms of where the faith community is on that issue, and you layer that on top of these dynamics that you're describing in a relationship. it's both complicated, but it's just very, very difficult, I think, for anybody to have to deal with, to basically be balancing all of those balls in the air at one time. So,
and we
we'll
know what
talk
that's
more.
like to. We know what that's like to be in a community where it's like an open secret, but it is a secret, right? So like, and what happens when there's an open secret is that you can't talk about the problems of that, like, because no one's acknowledging it's really happening. That you have the relationship, so you can't acknowledge that it's awesome, and you can't acknowledge that it's when there's a problem, and so, you know, there's a reason. That's where, you know, our communities become complicit. So if we say, all right, we'll roll with this if it's an open secret, but you're never explicit about it, we're actually constructing the built environment for abuse, right? And making it, and somebody who perhaps would not be abusive if they had more community accountability, right? Like, we're actually setting those people up to be more vulnerable to control. As somebody who, you know, if they had some eyes on them and people being like, hey, don't talk like that, you know, but when we can't acknowledge it because they're not out, so we think that, but we're not saying anything, blah, 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 then it's much easier to just ignore things that would be red flags otherwise.
Right. It's like in a don't ask, don't tell environment.
And don't ask, don't tell, that was like the most toxic environment. That was one of the most horrifying things in my, 25 years of doing LGBTQ specific advocacy. People in that environment, that was the most harrowing stories I've ever heard. And any environment that's like a don't ask, don't tell, where you can be there as long as nobody says anything, but the second you say something, it's a sudden death to that community. That is a harrowing, fraught, minute-by-minute, horrifying situation to be in. And our congregations, it's untenable for us to be creating those environments in our congregations.
And I want us to talk a little bit later about how we continue to do that. So, okay, let's go on to a few of the myths. Myths are always tricky because when we see a statement in myth form, it's very easy sometimes to read it as a fact. So I want to be real clear that we're talking about myths here. This is not how life is. But we want to deconstruct some of these assumptions that are operating. And again, there are 8 things listed here, but we're only going to talk about 3 of them. So Sharon, would you talk some about number 8? It's easier for LGBT folks to, in an abusive situation, to leave than it is for heterosexuals.
Thanks, Marie. One of the things that we need to be clear as we started this particular conversation is that many reasons why people have difficulty leaving, again, are still the same. Children, economics, fear for their lives, fear of being outed, as we talked about, is specific for people who are same-gender loving. And one of the things that I've discovered in the midst of that is that we really don't, and I'm speaking more now from the faith community, we really don't take serious the relationships of same-gender loving people. We don't think that it's a human relationship, that it's a correct relationship, the way that God has oriented us to be. And so we're really not taking seriously the relationship that they have. And therefore, we just think it's trivial to just, heterosexual couples are married and these couples are not, even though we now have the marriage laws that are out, many of them still are not married, and this is not something we're recognizing by the church. And so we trivialize the relationship that lesbian and gay people have versus, and so we take it serious about the heterosexual. Plus, we teach and we preach for heterosexuals to stay together. But we're preaching differently, for people that are lesbian and gay. And so the seriousness of it is really an important thing. And so what we need to know that it is, and maybe even just more difficult if you have to put a quantitative number to it, because in addition to all of the other reasons why people don't leave, don't want to leave, that the economics and the fear for their lives, the fear of being outed, not just by in the community, but also being outed within the faith institutions. One of my clients was African American, and she just said, I can't go and talk to this church because I go to a straight up black church. That's how she defined it. And they're not really taking serious of the issues that I'm having in my relationship because they're trying to speak out against it. I can't leave because I have to fight stereotypes, and they're from within and they're from without the community. But even most important, the whole issue of love. That we need to begin to understand that same gender loving people actually love their spouse just like we love our spouse, and that it's possible to be abused and still be madly in love with someone. And given that same emphasis to same gender loving couples, that it is possible for them, as much as we can't understand it, we don't know it, we can't wrap our minds about it, but we need to really believe that love is something that can keep people from leaving a relationship and really begin to understand that this relationship that they are having is real. They're going through this plus even more complications of leaving a relationship. My client said to me, she said, I literally got on my knees and I held their ankles and I refused to let her go. I begged her. I embarrassed myself not to leave her. And she said she did that in the name of love.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to your original comments, Sharon, about sort of the generic dimension of the power control issues within intimate relationships. And so there's some very, very similar dynamics that we shouldn't be surprised by.
Yeah. So let's and I would jump in to say that, just as Sharon said, that then people are having to fight back through all that to prove that their relationship is real, and that makes it harder to stand down from it. And then you put that in the context of, in many states you can't have custody of two people of the same gender of one child. So my sister and her partner are the first women in Kansas to share custody of kids, and that was done with like a magistrate secret, whatever, So that's hard to leave if you're not the legal parent of your children, because you're not going to have any rights to them. It's hard to leave if you're married in one state and living in a state that has no dissolution plan for you. You can't get divorced. So there are actual, in addition to all those important issues that Sharon just raised, there's also just structural things that are even compounding it far harder to make it a bigger challenge to leave. You weren't able to get a loan together in your house, so your abusive partner is the only person on the loan because you had a bank that wouldn't loan to two women, etc.
So it's compounded.
Yeah. And I think the other thing for all of us to remember is we've made so much progress on the marriage issue legally, but there are all these other issues, many legal issues that are not resolved by that, particularly around custody and kids, that continue to put people at a real serious disadvantage in dealing with this.
Yeah.
So
my major support of gay marriage was for gay divorce, to be able to have a way for people to get divorced.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Marvin, can you talk about men not being victims?
Sure. So this first myth, I think, is powerful because it also reflects certainly at least a partial truth, and that is that it's a very common pattern in this culture for men to be abusive of their female partners. But that pattern of male violence against women doesn't exhaust all the cases. Some intimate partner violence is also within same-sex relationship. So I think one of the things this suggests is that we need to exercise care, and it certainly includes faith leaders. Exercise with care, one of the most important resources any of us has for making change, and that's the power of naming, the power we have to interpret reality and to speak truthfully. So I think this myth is, for me, just a reminder to be careful with our assumptions. And even when we rely on a particular framework of interpretation that we're using to make sense of intimate partner violence, especially relying, as many of us do, on the interpretive framework of power and control. Even so, I think no matter what that interpretive framework is, we need to stay present to the people who we have in front of us and listen and learn from them what they're experiencing. And I think it's precisely because both men and women in same-sex relationships who have experienced abuse have courageously told their stories that the community has access to that experience and the possibility of deepening our understanding that not all intimate violence is male abuser, female victim. And I think it's also particularly important, I'd say, as a man, because I think it's confusing to many gay men in relationships where there's abuse to understand that men are not always the abuser. They are also able to be the abused. And this can be, I think, confusing, disorienting, but very important that others can stand with and help someone name their experience of abuse as abuse. And so while, again, I'd say it is true that in this culture, the prevailing pattern, to the extent we know, is male on female violence, we also have to make room in our interpretive framework for same-sex intimate abuse.
Yeah, very good. Very important. And one of the things that I find when I'm doing general training with a group of clergy or faith communities, and we get to the question that someone will raise about, well, what about men being abused? I usually respond, yes, of course men can be abused and are being abused, and particularly gay men. And at that point, the conversation stops. Because it's sort of like, again, it's not on the radar. It's not part of the general public's discussion, but it sort of says, yes, straight men can be abused, and the issue for gay men is certainly there. So I think it begins to expand people's worldview about what we're dealing with here. So can we go on to Connie? Our time is short, and the more common question, the issue of numbers, which you have some particular data on, I appreciate.
Yeah, so we could just flip to that slide. So this in 2010, the Center for Disease Control did its National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. It's the largest surveillance, data that we have on the prevalence of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in the country. And for the first time in 2010, they asked people about their sexual orientation. And so for lifetime rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner by sexual orientation, you can see the numbers on this slide, but 44% of lesbian women, 61% of bisexual women, 35% of straight women reported incidents of lifetime rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, and 26% of gay men, 37% of bisexual men, and 29% of straight men reported an incident of lifetime rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. So, to the point that was just made, people of all sexual orientations and experience rape and physical violence and intimate partner violence, right? And so it's important, if you go to the next slide, for us, but of all those folks who reported having an experience of lifetime violence, 83% of women and 35% of men reported significant impact. So this isn't just asking people, you know, did you have significant impact? It's saying, like, did you stay home from work? Did you go to the hospital? Did you have an injury? Were you afraid for yourself? So if we go to the next slide, the thing about this that I think helps reconcile some of the points that Marvin was making before is that people of all genders need support to survive the impacts of abuse. And we need to have our community resources and our advocacy resources able to show up for people of any gender who, because we know that people of any gender may be the target of abuse and violence. But the other thing that shows us is that the impacts of abuse are not gender neutral, that the consequences of sexism and et cetera, do result in different impacts over the population that we're talking about in any individual. 35% of men reported significant impact. That's significant. That's a big deal. But so this isn't to say anything about us not showing up for men. We 100% have to. But we also have to look at what is happening such that there's this, why are men more resilient in the face of that? And I honestly think one of the points about that came up in the last topic, which is one of the things that we could see as a negative or we could treat as a strength is that for many men it is there's a kind of allergic feeling of like, why the heck is somebody treating me like this? This is horrible. This is not consistent with how I understand myself would ever be treated. So that can be a negative in people like resisting looking at the thing, but also can be a positive of supporting that person to make a different choice, where many women say, I understand this is the way that women are treated, and it's not inconsistent with my, it's inconsistent with what I want, it's inconsistent with what my heart wants, but it's not inconsistent with what I imagine might happen to me over the course of my life. Like I knew this was a risk for me. So I think that's something that we can use actually as a strength if we're not using it to deny, minimize, blow off, whatever, but getting in there with people in a real way and saying, yeah, this doesn't have to be your life. This doesn't have to be tomorrow. This can be a one-time thing in your life, and here we are to help you with that. So.
Yeah, I think that's a very important implication of looking at that piece of the puzzle. So, okay, let's go on. So this, I'm just going to briefly comment on, again, what we're doing here is trying to visualize all of these factors, all these dynamics that we're lifting up and trying to pull apart to understand the particular social context that faces LGBTQ folks in both experiencing violence but also responding to it. So it's just a way to think about all of the pieces that we're talking about. And this is, Connie, do you want to comment further on any of this?
I think it works. I think works as a visual.
Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory, but we wanted to get that in front of people as kind of a summary of those contextual issues. So if we go on. So the particularity, again, let's look at three issues quickly. The institutional violence, the isolation, and the using vulnerabilities. Sharon, institutional violence, lack of civil rights and support. Any comment?
I think the only quick thing that I really want to say about it is this is a place where we can't depend on our human kindness to get through this. That we really have to be involved in advocacy. That seeing pastoral care is advocacy also, to get involved in legislations and a lawmaking that will take away the power of people that are in these systems to use these things against you.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can do this just out of the kindness of our heart. I haven't seen that happen yet in ways that need to happen. And I think this just says we need to get involved in advocacy.
Yeah, we need to be part of the changes that have to be made, so this is no longer the issue. Marvin, what about the issues of isolation?
Well, let me just say really sort of briefly is that, I think it always takes courage to disclose abuse. And I think for LGBTQ people, including queer people of color, there are just additional barriers to overcome for anyone who is experiencing abuse and seeking help. And I think naming abuse as abuse can be challenging because as members of a marginalized community, there's awareness of the community's own vulnerability and fragility. And so there's a kind of self-protectedness to protect the larger community, especially in a hostile cultural environment. I think also people often experience isolation because they're hit with the shame of being abused, but also dealing with what they rightly perceive as a larger cultural stigma about being in a same-sex relationship. And I think also LGBTQ persons who are experiencing abuse may not seek outside assistance because people are not prepared to believe them, and also not prepared to respond adequately. And so one of the reasons folks don't go to their pastors, for example, is they read their pastors as perhaps good-meaning persons, but people who are not ready and able to actually be helpful. And in fact, if they can't be helpful, may well, against their best intentions, actually be harmful. So I think all those factors increase that isolation that's so debilitating.
And I think we see that's where that piece about outing can also be so helpful for people to understand for all survivors. That one thing batters do is they do humiliating, demeaning things. They trick or coerce people into doing things outside their values, or things that will get them shade thrown at them by the people that they respect and their mentors and whomever. So that's that idea that you could be outed about being gay, but also that a batter could bring porn home, and that could be something that you don't know how to talk about. The respectability pieces come in there. So how do you talk to somebody that you want them to understand that you're a moral, ethical person, that you have these certain whatevers, and you believe that you will be judged in this certain way. So it doesn't have to just be your gayness. It could be that, drug use or all kinds of things.
Other values, yeah.
And that how that respectability, the fear that you're going to lose access because people won't understand either the experiment you were doing or the coercion that happened or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, the vulnerability. Any additional comment on that, Connie?
It just flips the script a little bit about how we understand what the control can look like. That also can look like exploitation, and that very often in our imagination in heterosexual domestic violence, we think of a big, strong man intimidating a little lady. And the thing is, batters also use their own vulnerabilities, their own areas where they experience fear or oppression or a sense of scarcity. They use that to control their partners. So they say, I lost my job because I'm out as gay. So now you have to get, you have to work 2 jobs and you have to pay for everything and you have to get between me and people's homophobia or what have you. And that, and as allies and as people that understand the experience of harm that our partners are dealing with, that the harm is real, that the homophobia is real, that the racism is real, that that we can be that #1 ally, and it can be very confusing to people when we say that batters are so powerful and survivors are so weak. Well, sometimes that power looks like exploitation. It's just exploiting every last iota of spiritual, emotional, physical work from the target of that violence to prop up a batterer based on all their, that they're using drugs or that they're depressed or that they have other real vulnerabilities that need help and support. So we can't minimize those, because then that person feels like there's nobody else to help them. We've got to show up and say, hey, survivor, I can help you with this burden with this person. Let them lean on me for a little bit so you can take a break, right? And that has a different relationship of compassion towards batterers, not one thing off of accountability, not one step away from accountability, right? But that recognizes that batterers, are dealing with the ish of the world too. So, and that goes to a myth that not only when you're being abused, survivors sometimes do sketchy things to survive abuse, up to and including using violence, and that often survivors are punished much greater for attempts to survive than batterers ever are at initiating the context of power and control that the person was having to fight back against. Right. So when we're in same-sex domestic violence, we have to be attentive to that, because we don't have gender, or the way that gender, sexism is structured to have us understand what a certain incident means. We have to be able to get to the treetops and understand what it means in context. So a person that's holding down 2 jobs, in a heterosexual context, you might always say, well, that's the batterer. He's got his jobs, he's got all the money. Well, that's not the truth for heterosexual folks. There's a lot of times women are working tons of jobs to take care of everything, right? But we can't use those shorthands. We have to actually show up with our full intellect and our full heart and listen and understand what's happening in that situation.
And I think in that regard, we'll talk more about this in the next webinar when we look at the pastoral issues. But one of the things, Connie, that I've found so helpful in your work over the years is your teaching about that the measure is whose life is diminished by the dynamics, and as a way of helping us see what we see and understand what it is, because it is very complicated in many ways. And I think that's one of the reasons that friends or family or clergy or whoever hesitate to engage, because they can't figure out what's going on. Right. And so we'll talk more about that in the 3rd session in November. But our time is running out, and I want to take a few minutes to talk about, we've already been talking some about how faith communities have failed, but to give each of you an opportunity to either give an example or cite a particular area in which we simply have not done our job as a faith community, and it's caused harm to LGBT folks struggling with these issues. Marvin?
Yeah, mindful of time, let me just say 2 things very quickly that we need to talk at much greater length about. One problem, I think, is, of course, the pervasive silence in so many faith communities about abuse generally,
right.
about same-sex abuse. And I think with that is the reluctance and the great discomfort of talking about evil. How possibly one human being could choose to act in such a demeaning and dehumanizing way to another, especially when that other person is their intimate partner. So I think that's one dynamic. I think the other problem I notice in many of our faith communities is that there is often a theology and ethic of love, but not connected with the demands of justice. And again, a lack of attention to how power is always present in all our relationships, including our most intimate relationships, and the need for us to pay attention to the requirements of justice in our intimate relationships in terms of the use and misuse of power and vulnerability. So those are 2 things I'd mention.
And I think we can flip both of those in terms of what we need to be doing differently as well.
Exactly.
Sharon, any specific failure that you want to lift up?
I also had jotted down about the love ethic, but not even in the sense of connecting it to justice. First of all, just really understanding in our Christian faith community that love is what is the greatest commandment, the new commandment, and that we haven't taken seriously enough in our faith institutions what that means, and what that means towards the humanity of all people. We can't fight for justice until we can fight that we can begin to understand that everybody is human and deserves to be loved and deserves to be cared for, deserves to be protected, deserves to be served, and somehow we're missing that, that whole issue of what that really means. And so we can't provide a safe space for our community of same gender loving people because we haven't taken that serious enough to even let them be in that community. And I'll give you a quick example. I was counseling a lady years ago, and she was telling me that she thought she was African American. She thought that she might be gay. And we had this conversation, and in the end, I suggested to her a list of churches that she could go to, where she could at least explore who she is in her faith, versus go to a place and be massacred almost because of what she's saying about who her gender is. And that lack of the love ethic to be with people where they are, it's just actually missing church.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Connie, any other failures you want to lift up? And
I think
pick one, only one.
We can get to the opportunities.
Okay.
I'll pass.
Okay, well, go ahead with opportunities then.
Well, I think part of it, and is just the flip side of the lack of that love ethic, is the opportunity for radical hospitality. And, and this is, I have I'm Jewish, and in our congregation was founded with a gay rabbi, and has been one of the few places in my life that have been truly integrated with straight and LGBTQ people, like where folks share, like you can just do your thing, and people are there with each other. It's hard to explain, but and in that, it's just a really amazing space in that way, and that also from that we are actually been able to ask some questions about how we're creating a built environment that, like the physical environment of how our classrooms are set up, how our spaces are set up, that build for hospitality, for people being together, and also are aware of potential harm. So like, how are we thinking about making a space that is aware that children have been harmed in congregations by people in leadership, whether those be clergy or lay leadership. So how are we physically making the built environment to be aware of that? So you say, well, that's not domestic violence, but that brings that conversation into our community in a different way, and gets the skill, start practicing the skill of what it means to talk about this and care about this. And so for us, it's like, I believe that there's that y'all have a scripture around people who are faithful in few will be faithful in many, right? Like, how do we build up the capacity? How do we start with something simpler so we can tackle the big thing? Right. And we think that harder is easier, but harder is always harder. We think that if the stakes are higher, we would show up better. That's not true. When the stakes are harder, we freak out more. So we have to be building those skills in the little ways, building and asking people, what's going on? How are you? How's your relationship? What's up? Making spaces where we're in each other's homes, all of those things to break isolation, so that when something happens or we think something's happening, we actually have the muscle and the practice and the skill to do something.
Yeah, and the relationships are in place
to
pursue that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go to Sarah here, and I realize we're over time, but are there any pressing issues that we're hearing from our participants, Sarah? I don't want to miss that.
Well, there is one question I think would be good to take on. So this person is in a congregation, and they have a significant number of LGBTQ people in their church. Let's see, how can I phrase this? They don't believe or teach that the Bible supports sexual relationships outside of heterosexuality as God's intention for men and women. We believe we can disagree without being judgmental. So the question is, must a Christian change his or her convictions about homosexuality in order to intervene effectively in cases of domestic violence? Big question.
Good question. Very good question. So within a faith community that basically the norm is a heterosexual norm, and a teaching that, as Marvin started off in the beginning, that LGBTQ relationships are not normative. How can that congregation be supportive or engage with the needs of LGBTQ people? So, anybody want to take a stab at that?
This is Sharon. I think what I heard is can we be different and still be okay with each other?
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that what has to be different is us understanding. In my denomination, our theme is that we may all be one, and one does not mean the same, but it means respecting each other for our differences, but understanding that the greatest piece of that is this radical hospitality, this radical love, where we can have that non-judgmental presence. And I think that if you can create that environment, not only might people eventually change how they think and see when they hear stories, but it would give people the freedom to speak and to speak out and have a place where they can do that without feeling they're going to be judged or crucified because of it.
Mm-hmm. Marvin, what do you think?
I think one of the things I'd say is I think in that context, what I would hope is there is a clear and consistent message being communicated that in all relationships of whatever kind, the expectation is for patterns of mutual care, respect, and a fair sharing of goods and resources, and to lift that expectation up across the board. But I would also say that I think faith communities, their credibility, their trustworthiness as being a resource for people who are struggling with intimate partner violence, including in same-sex relationships, what I would say is if you cannot first recognize, affirm, and bless as a loving relationships between two men or two women, you may not have credibility on challenging and trying to effectively address abuse. So that may sound contradictory, those two responses. I think you can do some limited good, but I think that the climate of heterosexual exclusivism is also a dynamic of abuse that those faith leaders and communities need to look at.
Because it limits their capacity to really be present to the LGBTQ folks in their community.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Connie, any other comment?
Hear, hear.
Is that an amen, Connie?
Yes, amen.
All right. Very good. Well, we are going to conclude, and I just want to thank each of my colleagues whom I respect so much for the work that they have done and continue to do addressing all of these issues and providing leadership for all of us around very important issues. Clearly there's a lot to discuss around the particularity of the LGBTQ community and facing and dealing with intimate partner violence, which we will continue to try to find ways to provide through Faith Trust Institute. As I said earlier, you've got additional resources that Sarah's providing you online. And then the November webinar, we're going to just shift the focus a little bit to that specific question. And we may, in fact, start with the question we just ended with of how does a congregation or a faith community engage specifically with its LGBTQ members when there is abuse and need for the faith community to engage, speak up, and try to provide help. So we'll be looking at those pastoral issues in that regard. But I appreciate your time, and sorry that we ran over. Hope you've been able to stay with us. And if you have other suggestions or ideas about ways that we can pursue this conversation, please let us know, and we'll do what we can to provide that. Anything else, Sarah?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us and thank the In Faith Community Foundation for their sponsorship here today. And as people are leaving the webinar, if they would fill out the survey and give us some feedback and ideas, we'd be very appreciative. I also want to say that I've provided as a handout this It Takes a Village People, Advocacy, Friends and Family, and LGBTQ Survivors of Abuse. It's a great resource. It's from Connie's organization. So that's something really worth taking a look at. And thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you. Okay.
Right.
Good day.
All right.
Bye-bye.